Welcome everybody. Thank you very much for coming. My name is Daisy Cooper. I'm the MP for St Albans, Deputy Leader of the Liberal Democrats and our Treasury spokesperson as well. And as well as being our Treasury, thank you, and I've got a fan at the back. Thank you, Spencer. And as well as being our Treasury spokesperson, I also chair our economy and business team, which covers Treasury, business, trade and work and pensions. And collectively, we are very apprised of the pressing need to come up with some new ideas on how to get growth into our economy, how to tackle the huge and inexcusable inequality that riddles our economy, how we can capture and hold on to the innovation that comes from this country, and increasingly how our economic policies can address the rise of populism. So we are actively discussing these questions in our group. And so I really welcome this opportunity to hear from you as members and from members of the Liberal Democrat History Group about, this is a question, a new economic policy for the Liberal Party, ? What are the lessons for today? And I'm really delighted to say that we are joined by two fantastic speakers this evening. The first speaker will be Richard Walker. Richard Walker had a career in teaching in the police before becoming ordained in the Church of England. He describes himself as a Keynes enthusiast and has recently given a talk on Keynes and his principles to the Lloyd George Society just last month. Our second speaker this evening is Peter Sloman, Professor of British Politics at Cambridge University's Department of Politics and International Studies. Peter's research focuses on political ideas, public policy and electoral politics in modern Britain. All thoroughly good Lib Dem conversation topics. His first book, The Liberal Party and the Economy, 1929 to 1964, explored how British Liberals engaged with economic thought in the era of Keynes and also Beveridge as well. So we're going to hear from each of our speakers for just about 20 minutes each, and then we'll open the floor up to Q&A. So do make a note of any questions that you have. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much indeed. It's lovely to be here. Thank you for your invitation. And my children asked me to pass on their thanks for encouraging me to get out a bit more. Nadine Aslam, in his wonderful book, The Blind Man's Garden, begins with the iconic line, "History is our third parent." And Keynes and Lloyd George, as you know, were born 20 years apart in 1863 and 1883. And they were born into a society which was undergoing incredible change, not just the technology that we're experiencing, same as we're experiencing today, but it was also a question of a change in belief. The advances in geology and the fossil record and the publication, particularly in 1859, of Darwin's Origin of Species, had meant a change in Britain's universities and a move away from traditional subjects to the moral sciences. Moral sciences, politics, philosophy, and economics. And John Neville Keynes, Maynard Keynes' father, there was 5 generations of the Keynes family, and they were all called John. All the eldest, firstborn boys were called John. So they never used the first name. So his father was called Neville, which became even more confusing because his daughter married Neville Hill. And he was always referred, John Maynard was always referred to as Maynard Keynes. So Keynes' father, who was an undergraduate at Cambridge studying mathematics, moved from mathematics to the moral sciences. And he studied economics under the legendary Alfred Marshall and political philosophy under Henry Sidgwick. Keynes joked about his father's association with Sidgwick, sort of saying that Sidgwick spent his whole life proving that Christianity was untrue and hoping he was wrong. So Neville Keynes married Florence Ada Brown, and Florence Ada Brown, Keynes' father, she came from a nonconformist background. Her father was leader of the Bunyan Centre in Bedford, and she was quite a Florence Ada Keynes was quite a remarkable woman. She became the first mayor of Cambridge, and also took a great interest in what her son was doing. All Keynes biographers mention the fact that when he was 5, he received a letter from his great-grandma Brown, which read, "Dear Maynard, you will be expected to be very clever, having lived all your life in Cambridge." So there was no pressure on the kid there. But he was very clever. So were his parents. So was his brother, who became a world-leading surgeon, and so was his sister. Of course, his father, Neville Keynes, had studied economics under Alfred Marshall. Keynes only studied economics for one term in his postgraduate year, but he studied under Alfred Marshall. Keynes got a scholarship to go to Eton College, which is not to be confused with the fee-paying public school, but he had a brilliant scholastic record there, and then went on to study mathematics at Cambridge. In 1906, his father thought that he should get a proper job, so he entered the civil service open examination and came second because he turned in a very poor paper on economics. So he got second prize and went to work in the India office. Yeah. The India office is important because it was Keynes never got to India. He wasn't interested in going to India. He got as far as Egypt. But whilst he was there, he wrote a book on the India banking and currency system, and so he got this overview of an economic system and decided that he didn't need the gold standard to operate. And one of the principal officers in the Indian office at that time was a man called Basil Blackett, who later moved to the Treasury. So Keynes left the India office a couple of years later in 1908, and then went back to Cambridge. But he was turned down for a fellowship, but was persuaded to teach economics by Alfred Marshall. Alfred Marshall had previously written to Keynes whilst he was at the Indian office, asking him to come back and teach economics. And Keynes had written to his friend Lytton Strachey, who said, Marshall is continually pestering me to be a professional economist. Do you think there's anything in it? I doubt it. And was question mark again. He went back. And Marshall paid him £100 a year out of his own stipend to teach economics. And his father coughed up another 100 a year. So he was earning the salary that he had whilst he was in the Indian office. Then on the 2nd of August, and this is where these historical coincidences come about, on the 2nd of August 1914, Keynes received a letter from Basil Blackett sort of saying, can you come to the Treasury? I want to pick your brains for the country's benefit. And you have to imagine this. Now, you're all far too young in here to remember what a motorcycle combination looked like. But the only way that Keynes could get from Cambridge to the Treasury was in his brother-in-law, Neville Hill's motorcycle combination. Keynes was 6'6". And if you can imagine trying to get, you've got this sort of Basil Fawlty figure with his knees under his chin, touching a briefcase, travelling the 65 miles to the Treasury. When he got there, he was confronted with the problem that there was a run on the Bank of England. £340 million was owed to London clearinghouses, and it couldn't be paid because of the impending war. So countries throughout Europe and so on had defaulted on these payments. These clearinghouses, in turn, had debts to pay, and they couldn't. And this had created a run on the bank. Now, in those days, they didn't have the funny money that we have now. It was actually backed up with gold in the Bank of England. And so people were wanting to exchange their currency, their sterling, for gold. And Lloyd George, by that time Chancellor of the Exchequer, saw that the gold remaining in the Bank of England at this time was about 25 million. So there'd been terrific depletion of the country's gold reserves. On the 31st of July 1914, Lloyd George closed the stock exchange and raised interest rates from 3 to 10%. Again, Keynes came in, looked at the situation and wrote this very long memo to Lloyd George. He advised Lloyd George that all the international obligations that the bank had should be honoured because London had a reputation as a monetary centre. It was managing other countries' finances. And if they were seen to have panicked at the first sign of a problem, then it would wreck trust in the future. So he said that international obligations should be honoured, but any domestic demand for gold, which included the domestic banks and individuals holding sterling, should be made in person at the Bank of England. And furthermore, there was a shortage of currency, so he recommended that we have an emergency printing of £1 and 10 shilling notes. Anybody, put your hand up if you remember 10 shilling notes. That's 10 shilling notes. And then Keynes wrote a rather triumphal letter to his dad, sort of saying, "Dear father, it was my memo that convinced Lloyd George." Keynes was then recalled to the Treasury on the 6th of January 1915, and he was engaged during the war on acquiring credit, because the First World War was fought on credit, and so there were very, very few sources of credit. Principally, it was the United States, and in particular J.P. Morgan. And Keynes made a couple of visits to the United States. Now, Britain at this time was financing the Allied war effort. So we were financing France, we were financing Italy, and to a lesser extent Russia, and we were borrowing money from the United States to do it. The first tranche of credit was 340 million, which was raised domestically, but after that it was mainly money from the United States, and it wasn't charity. We were buying a lot of goods from the United States. We were being charged interest and a 1% handling charge as well. So again, this was what Keynes was doing. One of the other things which might have ended up in none of us being here tonight was that Keynes was booked on the same trip to Russia as Kitchener. He was due to go to a conference in Russia, and he would have been on the same ship as Kitchener. The ship, if you don't know, struck a mine off the Orkneys and Kitchener, and all but 12, I think, of the crew died. So we might not have been here if we'd have been on that. Keynes, as you all know, was a member of Bloomsbury. They were all conscientious objectors when conscription came in 1916. Keynes wasn't actually a registered conscientious objector, but he did give evidence for people who were applying as conscientious objectors, particularly Duncan Grant, who was his one-time lover, and Lytton Strachey. And he wrote to his mother in 1916, "My country is now mortgaged to America. Our rulers are incompetent, mad, and wicked. And the end of this particular civilization is nearly over." You'll know that after the armistice, Keynes went to the Paris Peace Conference, and he was looking at advising the Allies on the amount of reparations and so on to be paid by Germany. He famously fell out with Lloyd George and sent a letter of resignation because he believed that Germany should be brought back into the family of nations, because he was looking at economic integration within Europe. Whereas, of course, Clemenceau, the French leader, and particularly Lloyd George and so on, they were looking at blaming Germany for all the damage that had been caused and getting the maximum amount in reparation. And Keynes thought that it was also rather confused because Woodrow Wilson, the American president, he'd also got a dog in that particular fight. He was quite very dismissive of Lloyd George. He said he only wanted something to take home to the people that would pass muster for a week. But his mother was particularly alarmed when Keynes sent her the first draft of the economic consequences of the peace, because she thought that the entire family would be sued for libel. And the way that he described, particularly the way that he described Lloyd George. But he went on to say in his book, economic privation proceeds by easy stages, but who can say how much is endurable, or in which direction men will seek at last to escape from their misfortunes? Now, Keynes was a liberal, and he saw liberalism as the middle road between socialism and laissez-faire economics, which he'd been taught under Alfred Marshall. And a lot of historians have questioned the extent to which Keynes was right But in 2019, there was a conference actually held at Cambridge, and it concluded, the historic conference at Cambridge concluded that Keynes' views, as he expressed them in the economic consequences of the peace, are still relevant, and they identified the main themes there as myopic nationalism versus economic integration. And then in 1923, Keynes published a book about the role of money in society called The Treatise of Money, and in the same year became very preoccupied with the high unemployment. What had happened was that Britain's markets in the staples of textiles and iron, coal, steel, and so on had dropped by about a third during the war. And there was also this mindset within the political, certainly within the political class, that they needed to get back to some nirvana of 1914, which included the gold standard, which we came back to in 1925. But the economic model that Keynes had been taught also taught that you needed a pool of unemployed people to make the economy work smoothly, and Keynes rejected that. In July 2023, for instance, there was 1.1 million, or 11.4% of the workforce were unemployed. The word unemployment first appeared in the Oxford Dictionary in 1888. And he also began to question the key assumption taught by Alfred Marshall, that over time an economy would reach a stage of equilibrium, and at that stage of equilibrium, where supply and demand gave you your idea of value, fixed price, and so on, you would have full employment, but it wasn't happening. And this led Keynes to sort of say, what I'm interested in is the short run. He was actually interested in short run aggregate supply in terms of economic theory. But of course, this led on to the thing, don't worry about the long term, the long run. In the long run, we're all going to be dead. So Keynes was instinctively a liberal, but he was hampered getting his ideas across by four things, really. Economic orthodoxy. Didn't see much scope for government except external defence, the maintenance of internal order, and the enforcement of contracts and land rights, particularly through the courts. There was also a great political reluctance to borrow. Gladstone was said to the ghost of Gladstone was said to still walk the halls of the Treasury. I don't know if he still does, but Gladstone famously said that money is best left to grow in people's pockets, and so again, there was this reluctance to borrow, and of course, after the war, the national debt had risen. The debt had been paid down between the Boer War and 1914 to the tune of 650 million. Sounds a bit silly, really, in today's figures, doesn't it? But they were very worried about the national debt of 650 million. By the time the war ended, the British national debt was 7.5 billion, and we owed 4.5 billion to America. So there was a reluctance to borrow. There was also the problem of the gold standard. Churchill, when he became Chancellor in 1925, wanted to get back, or he'd been advised to get back to the gold standard of 1914, and set it at I think it was 486. It was $4.86. Keynes had sort of said you don't really need the gold standard because he thought it was a false setting of a price for money. But he wanted it set. We had to go back to the gold standard at 436. What Churchill did was overvalue the pound, which further affected the exports of British goods, and so also made the employment situation worse. There was also the problem of attitudes to the poor, because at this time, the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 was still working, and the only way that you could give relief was in the workhouse. This went on really till about 1931, and it ended, it was made famous by a case in Poplar, where the councillors in Poplar had raised a rate, which they were then taken to court for, and several of them ended up in prison. So by 1926, you've got a situation where Baldwin's government and the trade unions are set on a collision course. The Liberals, as you know, lost the election of 1924, and then the possibility arose in Keynes' mind of an alliance with the Labour Party, and he famously said sensible Liberals should speak to sensible socialists. And he also had to get some sort of a rapprochement with Lloyd George. He'd fallen out with Lloyd George. But he also said, well, Lloyd George, as I say, he'd written to Margot Asquith during the Paris Peace Conference, I can't bear working for such a man another day, another hour. But then he went on to say, but actually, in 1920, Lloyd George declared we must have more output. We must put all our resources to work for the national good. And in 1924, he'd gone some way towards Keynes thinking that he favoured public works. And of course, Lloyd George also condemned what he called Churchill's egregious recklessness in setting the gold standard back at 1914. When he became reconciled with Lloyd George, Margot Asquith wrote to Keynes, dear Maynard, I would remind you that Lloyd George is a natural cheat, a liar, and would blackmail his own mother. Lloyd George then summoned 14 professors to Churt, and Keynes was then charged with industrial and financial organisation. This led to the famous Lloyd George pledge. Can Lloyd George do it? Keynes and Herbert Hutchinson wrote that, and Keynes very carefully costed all the public works programmes that were mentioned in there. It was sold for sixpence, and again in 1929 the Liberals did lose the election, but Lloyd George did actually back Keynes in that Keynes and in that particular respect. It's impossible. I've just been talking for 2 minutes. It's impossible to summarise the Keynesian model in a few words, but basically, what Keynes was arguing in the context of his own age, the changes in aggregate demand, the total spending on goods and services led to changes in consumption. What in the general theory of employment, interest and money, he would call the propensity to consume. And all spending then creates demand, creates more demand, and so on. And this was even taken up by Barack Obama in his economic policy in his first election thing. So Keynes thought, and I'll end here and I'll leave the lessons for today for anybody that wants to come back. He thought that national prosperity is cumulative. So like today when we're looking at the questions of growth, he thought that national prosperity is cumulative, stimulate demand, and that would call forth an increase in supply, which in turn would maintain and intensify demand. And at the end of the general theory of employment, interest and money, he said it's ideas versus vested interests. And at the end of the day, it's ideas that are important for good or ill.
Lovely, thank you very much. The enthusiasm was spilling over. I loved it. Peter, over to you.
Great, thanks very much indeed, and thanks for the kind invitation. It's great to be here. Richard has spoken mainly about John Maynard Keynes. What I'm going to do is focus on the Liberal Party and put the 1929 unemployment pledge in a kind of party context. And I mean, it's interesting that the 1920s, late 1920s, can be seen as a very creative and dynamic period intellectually for British Liberals, but also a period in which this only slowed rather than reversed the party's electoral decline. And of course, the effort to persuade voters that the Liberals could conquer unemployment eventually ran into the financial crisis of 1931 and the decision to join the national government and to give reluctant support to some quite painful austerity measures. So I think we've got to be careful not to romanticise this period. In some ways, I think it's a story that illustrates how hard it can be for a third party either to turn policy ideas into votes and seats, or to change the direction of government policy from the opposition benches in the face of an economic crisis. Now, if you look at the private papers and published work of liberals from the 1920s, I think three things stand out. The first is the bitterness of the divisions that had emerged from David Lloyd George's rise to the premiership in 1916 and his decision to fight the coupon election with the Conservatives at the end of the First World War. As many of you will know, even though the two wings of the party notionally came together in 1923, many of Herbert Asquith's followers remained deeply hostile to Lloyd George, and particularly to the way he sought to use the political fund he'd accumulated, and partly from the sale of honours as Prime Minister, to re-establish his influence over the party. Secondly, I think Liberals were a bit stunned by the way in which the Labour Party had usurped their position as the main rivals to the Conservatives and kind of broken out of the progressive alliance that had existed before the First World War to establish themselves as the main party of the working class, particularly in the cities and the heavy industrial areas. And this was really brought home to Liberals by the 1924 election, when after a relatively good performance in 1923, when the Liberals won 158 seats, the fall to just 40 seats brought home the extent to which British politics was settling into a class-based, polarised two-party mould. And then I think thirdly, it's striking just how many Liberals were prepared to put time and effort and money into trying to prevent the party from getting squeezed out. This was true most obviously of liberal academics and intellectuals like Keynes, who had plenty of other things they could be doing with their time, but were prepared to put their energies into liberal thinking. It was true of politicians like Herbert Samuel, who came back from being High Commissioner in Palestine and was recruited by Lloyd George to run and really put back together the party's organisation in the run-up to the 1929 election. And it was true of many activists on the ground. Now, as Richard said, the 20s were not a good decade for the British economy. The pre-1914 economic order had essentially been broken by the war. Trading relationships had broken down. Britain and other countries had accumulated heavy war debts, and trade unions have become more powerful in a wartime context in many industries. So there is really no roaring 20s in this country, and unemployment remains above 1 million all the way through the decade. The orthodox solution of trying to put back the pre-war economic system has a clear economic logic to it, and has quite strong support, particularly from Liberals with close links to the City of London. People like Francis Hurst, the one-time editor of The Economist, or D.M. Mason, who runs the Sound Currency Association and later becomes MP for Edinburgh East in 1931, are keen on this agenda of going back onto the gold standard and working to rebuild trading relationships through kind of bilateral negotiations. But taken by itself, this wasn't likely to be very attractive to working class voters if it meant bringing wage costs down. And at a time of stable or indeed falling prices, bringing real wages down implied falls in money wages, which invariably ran into trade union resistance. Now, it's worth noting that in the right circumstances, free trade could still be quite popular. The 1923 election showed that voters liked cheap food, and arguments for international economic integration still had some resonance. But free trade couldn't solve the unemployment problem by itself. Keynes, I think, was distinctive in his willingness to sort of draw sharp distinctions between what he saw as classical economic arguments and arguments about laissez-faire and arguments for essentially accepting the changes which had taken place in the British economy and adjusting government policy to make the best of the new situation. And as he put it in his 1924 lecture on the end of laissez-faire, the argument was that large firms and strong trade unions were essentially now a permanent feature of the industrial economy, and that British government should build on some of the forms of state intervention which had developed during the First World War, in order, as he put it, to manage the transition from economic anarchy to a regime which deliberately aims at controlling and directing economic forces in the interests of social justice and social stability. Now, the positive role which Keynes envisaged for the state here took two main forms. On the one hand, it should seek to humanise big industrial firms and to integrate them into the state by turning them into semi-autonomous public corporations. And the Manchester-based Liberals who had launched the Liberal Summer School in the early 20s, like E.D. Simon and Ramsay Muir, had already developed extensive plans for this kind of reform, such as the creation of joint industrial councils to fix minimum wage rates, statutory limitation of private profits, and public ownership of the coal mines and railways. So this was essentially a microeconomic agenda. At the same time, Keynes also believed that the state needed to exercise what he called directive intelligence over the economy as a whole by controlling currency and credit and coordinating savings and investment, what we would now call macroeconomic policy. And as Richard said, Keynes famously argued that the UK should not return to the gold standard of the pre-war parity, but the government should actively manage the currency in an attempt to stabilise prices, stop them falling further, and in particular gain the freedom to set bank rate at a low level in order to allow cheap money. He also argued that the government should use public works to stimulate economic activity, though it's important to note that he sometimes viewed this as a second best option in a context in which the currency was artificially overvalued and it was difficult to bring wages down. As Peter Clarke has shown, Keynes was working his way towards the developed theory of the general theory at this point, but he wasn't there yet. And in fact, it was in the process of trying to justify Lloyd George's schemes in the face of Treasury resistance and conservative criticism that he made some of the key theoretical moves. Now, both the Manchester Liberals and the Keynesian Cambridge economists like Keynes, who were involved in the summer school, essentially moved over to Lloyd George's side in the intra-party debates of the mid-20s. Partly because they recognised that Lloyd George was a more dynamic figure than Asquith by this point. There was an intellectual self-confidence about Lloyd George that was attractive. The inquiries that he launched into coal policy and land reform helped to re-establish his progressive credentials. And his even-handed attitude towards the general strike contrasted with Asquith's instincts, which were to essentially support the Conservative government against the trade union Congress. So, not long after the general strike, Lloyd George successfully managed to succeed Asquith as Liberal leader and put up some of his money to run the Liberal Industrial Inquiry, which essentially brought together the summer school's thinking into a single document, the famous Yellow Book. This called, among other things, for an economic general staff to advise the government on policy, for closer public control over the Bank of England, which at this point was still largely a private institution, a national investment board to control public investment, quite a complex system of trade boards and wages councils to provide for a form of industrial democracy, and measures to bring utilities into public ownership. And as Richard said, this document, which was quite a sort of broad and sort of worthy economic agenda, was dramatised for the 1929 election by Lloyd George's famous pledge to reduce unemployment to what he called normal proportions within 1 year, through a £250 million programme of investment in roads, housing, telephones, electricity generation, land drainage, and London transport, financed by borrowing without adding a penny to taxation. The idea of a time-limited pledge seems to have been suggested by Seaburn Rowntree, a famous Yorkshire-based industrialist, as you know, and it seems to have been Rowntree's assistant, William Wallace, who worked with Keynes and others to draw up detailed proposals. Not Lord Wallace, I should say. I don't know what he's okay, it's sometimes been suggested by historians that Lloyd George's plan for public works didn't have widespread support within the Liberal Party. Now, it's certainly true that many Asquithians were hostile to Lloyd George and thought the idea of a pledge was gimmicky and possibly a hostage to fortune. Sir John Simon, for instance, warned that the Liberals would look like a cheap jack in a fair if they claimed to offer a patent remedy which could sweep away unemployment without question and without delay. It's also true that many Liberals probably didn't understand some of the theoretical arguments which Keynes was making, for instance, about the multiplier effect. Indeed, Lloyd George himself sometimes fell back on what you would now see as basically supply-side arguments about the value of investment in infrastructure and in order to improve relations' productive capacity over the longer term. But the idea also captured people's imagination. National development works had a strong Liberal pedigree dating back to the 1909 People's Budget, and Keynes and his colleague carried quite a lot of weight as economic experts. And so, in the run-up to the election, the Asquithians hedged, arguing that the basic policy was sound, but that setting a target for a number of jobs that would be created was probably inadvisable. And I think what we see here is probably a basic difference in political styles. Lloyd George was an activist who saw the war effort as a model of how bold leadership could mobilise the nation around a common goal. By contrast, people like John Simon or Viscount Grey were temperamentally more cautious. An analysis of election addresses has found that 52% of Liberal candidates mentioned Lloyd George's pledge explicitly in their election address. But even most of those who didn't mention the pledge explicitly still put a lot of emphasis on employment as an issue. Now, clearly the election campaign was a disappointment. The party took 23.6% of the vote, but only won 59 seats, mainly through gains from the Tories in East Anglia, the West Country and rural Scotland, along with a few urban seats. In industrial areas, it was Labour who made gains, allowing Ramsay MacDonald to form a minority government. That said, I don't think we should underestimate the impact which the pledge had in helping to keep the Liberals alive as a political force and in giving candidates something concrete to offer voters, including in rural areas. And if you look at the schemes, lots of the schemes into roads and land drainage and telephones and electricity have particular resonance in a rural context. Now, I'll say a few words in the time available about the afterlife of the pledge. As many of you will know, the experience of the 1929 Parliament is a messy one. I think 3 points need to be made. The first is that the Liberals were in quite a difficult position because even though they theoretically held the balance of power, Ramsay MacDonald and the Labour government were determined not to work with them. And so Lloyd George spent most of the 2 years after the election engaged in parliamentary manoeuvring in an attempt to bring MacDonald to terms, in particular to influence policy and above all to gain the alternative vote. So Lloyd George spotted that getting AV in place would help to safeguard Liberal seats in a future election in a context in which Labour was increasingly putting candidates up in the rural seats which the Liberals had won from the Conservatives. And so debates about unemployment became tied up in this effort. At first, Lloyd George criticised Labour strongly for not engaging in the big, bold schemes he proposed in the election campaign. By the spring of 1931, as a Liberal alliance started to come together, he began to play down these differences and to put more weight on concrete schemes for public works, like a rural house building scheme drawn up by the Liberal MP Sir John Tudor Walters. Secondly, it's important to note that the economic context changed very significantly as a result of the Wall Street crash. So by the end of 1929, it's clear that a set of spending commitments designed to eliminate 1 million unemployed was no longer going to be enough to get unemployment back down to normal proportions. And at the same time, many economists became more worried about the impact which large government loans would have on financial confidence, business confidence, in a context of a global recession or depression, compared with a context in which the world economy was doing quite well and Britain was lagging behind. And when Lloyd George sent a young economist to talk to Keynes in the summer of 1930, the economist reported back that Keynes was still in favour of public works, but thought that the effect on unemployment and business psychology would be very small compared to what their effects would have been before the world depression began. Keynes started to express an interest in tariffs as a way of protecting domestic producers, and so too did some of Lloyd George's critics within the party. Lloyd George, on the other hand, doubled down on his support for free trade because keeping the Tories out as the party of protection became a key justification for his Lib-Lab cooperation strategy. The third thing I think we need to note is that the 1929 pledge was based on borrowing for capital investment, not for running a current budget deficit. And so as the recession takes hold and the budget deficit grows, many liberals become more concerned about government borrowing in a context in which that borrowing is not being done to launch public works that will have beneficial effects on the national economy in the long term, but essentially it's borrowing in order to pay the unemployment benefit bill. And on this, many Liberal MPs, just like Philip Snowden as the Labour Chancellor of the Exchequer, are essentially unreconstructed Gladstonians. It is a Liberal motion that sets up the famous or notorious May Committee in the spring of 1931 to review government expenditure. And that's the committee which warns that Britain faces a budget deficit of £120 million if nothing is done, and calls for cuts, including cuts in unemployment benefits, and that plays a key role in bringing the Labour government down. Now, by the time the May Committee reports in late July 1931, Lloyd George has been removed from the scene, quite unexpectedly, by an operation to remove his prostate gland. And Herbert Samuel, as acting Liberal leader, has the challenge of trying to hold together a party which is splintering in various directions. And so in a context of a European financial crisis, in which there are bank failures in Austria and Germany and a run on sterling, Samuel is called into meetings in Downing Street with the cabinet and leading Conservatives, and he takes with him the leading Aswithian and North Cornwall MP Sir Donald Maclean, who is known to be a fiscal hawk. And it is in this context that the party's underlying orthodoxy becomes quite politically important, because Samuel and Maclean accept advice from the directors of the Bank of England that only a cut in unemployment benefit will be sufficient to stem the run on the pound and keep sterling on the gold standard. And when the Labour government falls over that unemployment benefit cut, they agree to serve with Macdonald in a national government. Okay, two very brief closing reflections. The first question, which lots of economists have asked since the 1930s, is would the plan have worked? Modern econometric simulation suggests that the public works programme was probably not big enough to meet the pledge. And under fixed exchange rates, under the gold standard, a large domestic stimulus of this kind might well have caused serious balance payments problems. So there might well have been seriously, perhaps damaging political repercussions and economic repercussions of trying to implement the pledge in the context of 1929, particularly after the Wall Street crash. I think what we can say is that if anyone could have done it, it would have been a majority Liberal government under Lloyd George as the man who won the war, trying to mobilise the resources of the nation in this great national effort. This was not the kind of policy that could have been carried out by a minority Labour government, which faced significant suspicion from the financial markets and the business community, in which the strings are being pulled by a third party from the opposition benches. So I think the idea that the Great Depression could have been avoided if only Lloyd George, if only MacDonald and Slogan had listened to Keynes, which was quite widespread in the 60s and 70s when Keynes seemed to have kind of basically solved everything. That doesn't really hold up to scrutiny for that period. Nevertheless, I think that the second reflection I would make in closing is about legacies. Keynes's own involvement in the Liberal Party is fairly minimal after 1929. The party was declining, and he could achieve much more direct influence on policy as a government advisor and as a kind of freelance public economist writing articles for the Times and deploying his considerable charisma and public presence. I think he agreed to sit on the Liberal benches when he became a peer in the Second World War, but he wasn't particularly active in the party. After the 1931 crisis, though, the Liberals nevertheless began to argue for public works again in the course of the 1930s. And of course, but once the general theory came out in 1936, the theoretical rationale for that became more compelling. But as time went on, I suppose by the 1950s, all of the parties are Keynesian in some sense. Keynesian economics becomes the kind of common currency of post-war economic policy. But I think the 1928 Yellow Book and the 1929 Pledge nevertheless remain very important reference points for the left of the Liberal Party and for a generation of post-war liberals who grew up with Keynesian economics and saw Keynes as an example of the kind of liberal who was willing to challenge classical economic orthodoxy. That was true of the Radical Reform Group in the 1950s. It was also true of David Steele, who told Marxism Today in a 1986 interview that as far as modern liberalism was concerned, Keynes and Beveridge were the father figures, not Adam Smith or anyone else who might have been around. Now, this kind of social liberal origin story or sort of story of intellectual rebirth may or may not have been particularly good history, but I think it has had a powerful impact on how liberals and Liberal Democrats have thought, both about themselves and about their party and about the economy.
Thank you very much. The lesson from that is that what goes around comes around. Duncan, you have a few words to say about the Liberal Democrat History Group before we go to Q&A.
Yeah, thanks very much. My name is Duncan Bragg, editor of the Journal of Liberal History. Thank you to Daisy for chairing us, by the way, as well as both speakers. I just want to say a few words about what we do as the Lib Dem History Group. Apologies to those of you who've heard this before, but we have some new people here, I know. We were founded when this party was established in 1988 to promote research and discussion of issues around the history of liberalism and the Liberal Democrats and its predecessor parties. And we do this in four main ways. First, by organising meetings like this. I can tell you our next meeting will be in London in the National Liberal Club in June or July. We haven't finally settled the topic yet, but it'll probably be something around the survival of the party in the really bad years in the 30s, 40s and 50s, when it was almost extinct, and how we managed to avoid that. And then there'll be a fringe meeting at our autumn conference in Bournemouth, and we will be launching our new booklet on liberalism, the ideas that built the Liberal Democrats. We published this in 2 editions before. It's our most popular book, so it's looking at ideas of liberal concepts of liberalism, liberty, equality, community, the strands that came together to form the party: Whigs, Radicals, Peelites, Social Democrats, etc., etc. Second thing is we publish a range of booklets like that one. You can see our 2 most recent ones, which are a concise history of the party and a summary of the greatest achievements of Liberal governments and Liberal MPs on our stand in the exhibition, just through there. And thirdly, we published a Journal of Liberal History, a flagship publication. So quarterly, this is the latest issue with articles and reports of meetings and book reviews. This one is leading on the Rainbow Circle and the history of liberalism in coalition government 2010-2015, attractively called Liberalism in Power, Watching the Titanic. So subscribe to this in either digital or print form, really enthusiastic both. And then fourth thing we do is maintain a website at liberalhistory.org.uk. So come and talk to us in the exhibition. You can subscribe, you can look at the booklets. And if anybody is willing to help us run the group, we think we do quite a lot on quite a small number of people. So we're always looking for people to volunteer to help. Thanks very much.
Lovely, thank you very much. As always, we've done in the title of his article, are subtle as a brick. Might be good to open up to Q&A. So when you put your hand up, do please say your name and any relevant descriptor to this session. And please keep your comments relatively brief so we can get as many questions as possible. Thank you. And I start with this gentleman here at the front.
Hi, thank you. I'm Joe Studwell. I have two questions. One comes from what Peter was saying about City of London connected members of the party wanted to go back on the gold standard. And I just wonder, to what extent was a division within the Liberal Party between City of London connected people in London on the one hand and manufacturing mainly northern Manchester people? To what extent was that always a fissure within the Liberal Party as opposed to the better known divisions that damaged the and the second question is slightly provocative, but I want to ask it. So if we think of Keynes, or we think of Beveridge, we think of Gladstone, people in the liberal tradition who thought very broadly and very deeply about big problems. We haven't seen such people, have we, since the 1950s in the Liberal Party? Why might that be? They're running a history group.
Two further questions. Thank you. Can I see a show of hands? The lady at the front here, on the front row. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Hanya. What is the solution to the complete balls up of an economy that we have today?
Lovely. Thank you very much. Last one on that. And I've got a gentleman right at the back.
Stephen Riddle, Little Economics at Ruskin College. It seems to be more of an upswing of the view and acceptance of the view in society that the purpose of the economy is to make rich people richer. Would you agree or disagree with that in a historical context? And can you, from the cuts to unemployment that were mentioned, very relevant to the cuts in disability we're currently seeing, where instead of disabled people working full-time on their health, they're having to neglect their health and work for paid employment to make the shareholder class richer. So could you articulate a view on what an economy is for that is better than it should make the rich richer and hopefully a little more user-friendly than it's for efficiently allocating goods and resources?
Lovely, thank you very much. So we've got a few questions there. So the City of London sort of split within the party. I can't read my own writing. Why have we got any big thinkers? Something about how we drew up the balls up, I think was the technical phrase you used today. And does history tell us that we're making the rich richer? So I'll start.
I think one of the, to address your point about the status of thinkers now, in those last 2 years at university, Keynes worked out what he actually believed. He was a big fan of George Edward Moore and so on, but he had worked out a belief system, and I think that this was also reinforced with a very close relationship that he had with Beatrice Webb. Beatrice Webb had lost any Christian belief, but she'd actually replaced it, if you like, with this sort of idea of service to humanity. So I think that there was, and this gave Keynes, I think, some moral authority because he actually believed in what he was doing. So all his equations and his theories and so on were actually working towards the end of the betterment of society. I think to address your question about the balls up of the economy, the best thing to do is to read Kate Rawler's book, Donut Economics. She sort of says, like Keynes thought we'd got it all cracked now. In 1930, I think it was the economic prospects for our grandchildren. He said that by 1935, providing the population doesn't grow too much, providing we don't fight any unforeseen wars, and all that sort of thing, technology and compound interest will have enabled us to crack the problem that has bedeviled humanity for 300,000 years, that of scarcity. And then we would all be able to sit back and try and answer the real questions, how to live our lives profitably, well, and for one another's benefit. But he thought we've got it all cracked now in 5 years' time. And interestingly, he said that we wouldn't need to be working more than 15 hours a week because we would have solved all these problems. But I think the problem that Keynes didn't foresee was that when is enough? Enough. And you can't really look to Keynes for the answer to that, because when he died in 1946, he left an estate of £400,000, which in today's money is roughly 14 million. And he also had a book collection valued at 80 million. And of course, Keynes also thought, his thinking was that what we ought to be moving towards is civilization. He saw the thing that we should all be interested in was to live a civilized and peaceful life. He hated war because it detracted from what he saw as civilization. And of course, he was a bit of a snob because he thought that the civilization and the civilizing effects would come from the middle class.
Good stuff, thank you. Over to you.
Thank you. I'll take a few of the questions in turn, if that's okay. The question on the city is a really interesting one, because when I was researching this, I went looking for particularly industrial voices who were criticising the return to the gold standard. And I found it harder to find them than I expected. If you look at the Hansard for the debate after Churchill announces the return to gold, there's a Liberal MP for Hull, I think, called Kenworthy, though I may be getting the name wrong, who welcomes it enthusiastically. Because, of course, if you're in an export trade, then particularly shipping, then getting world trade going again is the key thing. And I think there is a little bit of a sense, at least at that point, that it's maybe some short-term pain for long-term gain. Of course, it may be easier for some people to see things in those terms than others. And as time goes on, it becomes clear that the long term is an awful long way away. But I think, even Keynes, once the UK is back on gold, basically kind of accepts that that's where it is and tries to find ways of working around it. So there is less sort of ongoing agitation about that than I think we might have expected. Have there been no similar ideas since the 1950s? I wouldn't want to sort of fault down the serious thinking that many Liberals and Lib Dems have been doing in recent decades. I think what I would say is that for economists in particular, that there are now so many other avenues to influence. Obviously in think tanks, but also a huge expansion of the government's own economic advisory capacity in the Government Economic Service since the 1960s. And of course, the Labour Party has become more congenial to what we might call academics or intellectuals or public thinkers than seemed to be the case in Keynes's era, where you kind of had to have trade union credentials really in order to be taken seriously, unless you were, or you had to at least pay lip service to socialism in a way that Keynes and others were not prepared to do. Obviously, that has changed. On the other questions, I think, the one thing I would say is that, Keynes there's an extraordinary juxtaposition in Keynes's thinking between economic possibilities for our grandchildren, a lecture given in 1930 in which he's talking about an economy of abundance and the long-term difficulty being one of adjusting to abundance, and the immediate short-term reality in front of them, which is slow growth, very serious fiscal pressures on government and high unemployment. And of course, now we have two of those three problems. We don't fortunately have high unemployment, but we do have very serious, and clearly some people are not working who might want to be working. And there's all sorts of challenges around insecurity and precarity within the labour market, which this government is starting to get to grips with. I think one point that always jumps out at me is that I suspect Keynes thinking we would only need to work 15 hours a day didn't account for just how much money is being. Sorry, 15 hours a week. 15 hours a week.
I started 15 a day.
Members of Parliament.
Yeah.
But didn't account for the point which many liberals in that era could have told him, which is the capacity of land as a finite resource to absorb a larger and larger share of people's own.
Thank you. I'm trying to hold myself back from commenting as well. I'll do it at the end maybe. Let's take another round of questions. I've got Jeff at the front here.
The thought just occurs to me that he's talking about the economic consequences for our grandchildren. The idea that the economic problem has been solved and then you can move on to something else. It reminds me a bit of the end of history. But it also reminds me of Marxism as well, sort of going through different stages and eventually reach a stage where you solve the problem. And it's a kind of utopianism, really, isn't it? And do we sort of, and of course, we have Bear and Brown for the abolished boom and bust as well. So, but surely the lesson to learn is that we can't think like that anymore on economics, because it always goes horribly wrong.
On the optimistic note, we'll have the gentleman here and then go to the back. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm Tom Reed from Kingston. First of all, I didn't quite feel, maybe I didn't quite understand, but I didn't feel that you answered the question from the gentleman in the back. His question about people working and getting their share of the economic money, which is my interpretation of what he said. My question really is: do you feel that inequality is economic and wealth inequality is the elephant in the room when we're talking about economics and the current political environment? And do you think that Keynes had any sort of prescriptions for that?
Thank you. I used to back to Charlie.
I'm Charlie Miller, I'm the MP for Whitney. Could you explain a little bit more about what free trade meant in theory and practice in the 20s and 30s in terms of the empire, America, Europe? That would be helpful.
Thank you very much. Is there one more question to take? I'll take the gentleman in front here.
Kevin Lampard. Just to build on the free trade question, do you think what Trump is doing in terms of tariffs is going to change the sort of political and wider political discourse here?
I'm going to add all my comments at the end, otherwise you just get 40 minutes of me. Great. So, should we give up on the idea of the end of history and the end of economy, or economic thinking? Inequality and wealth is like the elephant in the room. I've got something to say about that. What did free trade look like in the 20s and 30s and the impact of tariffs? So, would you like to start?
Sure. I mean, I feel a little bit hesitant on the sort of big normative contemporary political questions, because even though I have views, I'm not sure I'm any more expert on them than anybody else. I think, I mean, in terms of inequality, yeah, I mean, Keynes, I think, was concerned about inequality, but he had the luxury of living in an age in which there was still room for significant egalitarian progress, while still leaving him pretty rich. Yeah. I mean, I think there are challenges around the whole sort of Bloomsbury group insofar as, many of them, like Bertrand Russell, are drawn to ideas like universal basic income because they like the idea of allowing everybody to have the kind of leisure and the freedom that they have to focus on artistic pursuits and intellectual activities. And of course, I think there probably are challenges in the post-war world has been a more complex world in terms of working out, how to pursue equality in practice while maintaining incentives for growth and so on. I mean, it is striking that, if you look at global discourse, I think inequality has had a higher political salience since the 2008 crisis than during probably the 10 or 20 years before that. I mean, we've had, Richard mentioned Kate Raworth, we've had Thomas Piketty and others sort of putting inequality on the agenda. And we seem to be living in a moment where the Labour government is pivoting towards focusing, actually, let's get growth first, and then worry about the questions of distribution afterwards. And of course, that raises all sorts of questions, but you can kind of see why they're doing that. If they don't think they can engage in sort of zero-sum redistribution from the rich, which is politically difficult and politically painful for any government. Can I jump to the question about free trade in the 20s and 30s? I mean, free trade, in terms of liberal thinking, at this point is almost an absolute. Do you know what I mean? It is a matter of sort of unilateral economic disarmament in the belief that free trade in principle is a good thing. The argument that had been made against protective tariffs in 1906, in particular, when Joseph Chamberlain had made imperial preference his big conservative rallying cry and wrapped the Tories in Union Jack, and said this will hold the empire together, the Liberals say no, it won't. It will tie imperial relations, which should be conducted on the basis of fraternity and cooperation, in endless reciprocal tariff negotiations about who gets what. And so the Liberals are very strongly opposed to that. And then, the Liberal ministers resigned from the national government in 1932 over the Ottawa agreements, which are designed to embody that kind of imperial preference. Obviously, that positioning poses challenges for Liberals in quite a lot of areas. It's interesting that Liberal MPs from East Anglia disproportionately stick with John Simon and stay with the national government because they like the idea of agricultural protection and quotas and tariffs that will, not tariffs, quotas and subsidies that will help make things like the sugar beet industry profitable in Norfolk. And so I guess one shift which Liberals have to make after the Second World War is to accommodate themselves to a world where, for instance, agricultural subsidies are a kind of permanent thing. And one reason why EU membership, EEC membership is so attractive in Joe Gribben's era is that it kind of gets the Liberals away from debates about unilateral, universal free trade towards a sort of Europeanization of the trade question.
Anything on Trump tariffs, your views?
Let me think about that.
Still biting my tongue. Excellent.
The point you made at the back about Keynes and redistributing wealth. The only thing I can remember is that Keynes was very much against any depression of wages. It was the current thinking was that if you got control of prices would go down. So you could actually depress wages because the workers then wouldn't need so much money to buy the goods. And Keynes always argued against that. In terms of the subsidy, there's a subsidy given to the coal owners, for instance, in order for them to maintain wages because they were operating at a loss. Keynes didn't see any reason at all why these people should have to suffer a loss in wages. Keynes also was an early thinker on ecology. he maintained that capitalism, whilst it provided the means of prosperity and so on, he was frightened that if it was unregulated, it would lead to ecological damage. In fact, the first treatise that was written on ecological damage was written by Alexander von Humboldt in 1807 in a publication called Cosmos. And he warned then, he'd been in Venezuela and South America, and he warned then about the effects of humanity, particularly on water use and deforestation. But Keynes was concerned about that. I don't know enough about tariffs really. I think Trump is well awful, but he's obviously Keynes was brought up on David Ricardo and the classical economists, and Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage, which stated that every country gets good at producing something, and you become a low-cost producer, but it's still in your interest to trade. So they believed in free trade. So tariffs were really were any restraint on trade was seen to be a bad thing.
Thank you very much. I'm hoping to get some questions about lessons for the future. Has anybody got a question related to that? I've got 3 questions in a row. Let's start with the gentleman in the brown here, and then the hand behind you who I can't see it is, and then behind that.
I'm William. I'm the chair of the Young Liberals and youth officer for the party. In terms of questions for the future, one thing I've been hearing quite a lot in this discussion, implicitly and explicitly, is fiscal rules in the sense of how much the government should borrow and how much should spent by the government borrowing in what areas, say, the debates over using government borrowing to fund unemployment, for example, in the 1920s, 30s. Mm-hmm. Do we need, going forward, looser fiscal rules than we currently have? And to what extent should they be loosened?
Thank you. Still biting my tongue. Okay, the hand close to you there, yep, and the gentleman behind.
Yeah, I'm Nick Taylor. I'm actually an economist. I suppose my question would be that Keynes and Lloyd George challenged economic orthodoxy in the late 20s. What should the Liberal Democrats be doing to challenge economic orthodoxy now? Because it seems to me that our economic spokespeople are largely echoing orthodox economics rather than any alternative.
You may have to elaborate on that in the bar, Mick. This is a bus stop. Yeah, go on. I'm gentleman at the back, yeah, that one there, please.
Thank you both very much so far. My name is Sam Marks, and I'm a 4th-year history student at the University of Edinburgh. And I bring this up because my question is related to education. Right now, education, specifically universities in the UK, seem to be going through very problematic times. Edinburgh is facing a 140 million reduction in budget. Dundee University is going to be going bankrupt in June, and the fate of that university is unknown. Myself and a lot of my fellow students and also staff members of the university are absolutely petrified about the future and what is unfolding in terms of education, which is a huge, not only investment in the UK's future, that was an incubator in people like Keynes's ideas for the future and changing the world, but also a huge international boon on the economy as well. So my question is, what role should education play in the future, and how are the Lib Dems going to work to save the university structures?
All good questions. Still biting my tongue. I'm going to say something at the end. Okay. Right. Okay. So fiscal rules. Maybe you can give us a historical view on that, or anything contemporary you'd like to say. Challenging economic orthodoxy and universities and education. Would you like to start?
Well, I think on fiscal rules, the one thing that we don't hear a lot about from politicians seems to me, sat there in mid Wales, is the size of the national debt and what we're going to do about it. It's sobering to think that each of you here, well, including myself, of course, we all owe £38,700. That's our share of the national debt. And according to the OBR, this year we will have spent nearly £100 billion on servicing that debt. So, you're looking at a future which is going to be dominated just simply by the amount of debt. So I think, and Keynes, I think, would sort of say that in the good times, you bring the debt down. So he wouldn't be against raising taxation to actually get the debt down. In terms of education, what I did want to mention tonight, I come from, I've lived for the past 16 years in a little place in Mid Wales called Talgarth, and we have a new venture there called Black Mountain College. Black Mountain College is really worth having a look at because this is looking at education. It doesn't answer your question about the amount of redundancies and the financial problems that universities have, but it is a new way of actually educating people for the future and living, and enabling people to actually deal with an uncertain future regarding the climate. We see this particularly in sat as we are in the middle of the national park, in the Brecon Beacons. We should call it that now. It's Ben O'Brien. But we have got the beginnings of a new way of educating people to actually adapt to the future and to engender in people, and particularly in young people, something called radical hope, which is trying to envisage a future that you can't actually see now. But that we have the ability to do this. And if we think positively about it and we all get on board with these sort of ideas, then I think that can be done. And I would go back to my ideas of Kate Rawth. She's married to a man called, I think his name is Roman Cesarevich. And sorry. And he's written a book called The Good Ancestor, which is really well worth reading. And he also runs a project in Oxford called the Empathy Museum. And William McAllister, anybody from Oxford, thinks that we should be looking at the future. What do we owe future generations? Because coming from Wales, we've got the Wales Wellbeing Future Generations Act, which we have to look at the impact of what we're doing on people that are going to follow us. Which again brings us back to that idea of radical hope. That I'm not going to be around for very much longer, but I've got children, grandchildren, and we owe them a great deal to actually solve these problems that we've got now. Because otherwise we're going to be leaving our kids in huge debt.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's sobering, isn't it? I mean, I think it is really interesting to me some of the discourse around fiscal rules at the moment, because clearly Rachel Reeves has kind of turned them into her sort of lodestar and sort of self-imposed constraints, and they're becoming kind of constraints by the week as interest rates remain high and borrowing keeps coming in over target and so on. I mean, I think the thing I would say is that they have been, most of the changes to fiscal rules since 2010 have loosened them. And so I think we have to be careful not to talk as if Reeves's rules are the same as George Osborne's rules or the same as Philip Snowden's sort of commitment to a balanced budget. These are rules designed to stabilise national debt. And there is in a sense, a very Keynesian, very 1929 distinction between capital and current spending underlying the current government's rules, designed to ensure that when the government is struggling for money, it doesn't just cut public investment. And I think that's probably right, even though there are some things around the settings of the fiscal rules that maybe could be different. I mean, I think that the fiscal arithmetic is just really hard. And I think one of the lessons from the 20s, which is sobering, which someone pointed out to me some time ago, is that one problem that you get in the 1920s for the Labour Party and the Liberals is so much of the money that people are spending in taxation is going either on the national debt And I think in 1929-30, about 40% of total public spending was going on debt interest repayments. So thank goodness we're nowhere near that yet. But it's rising. Or on unemployment benefit spending, and that crowds out more electorally attractive things that government could spend money on, or things which are really important, like the university system, but don't seem to be a political priority. And I guess the challenge for the Lib Dems is that the party went into the last election proposing, I think, 26 billion of tax and spending increases. Rachel Reeves cut up taxes by 40 billion, but has not been able to fund within that 40 billion everything that Lib Dems said that a Lib Dem government would want to do. And so that raises the kind of question, well, if the party thinks other things deserve priority, and if you take them individually, they kind of are all very credible priorities. How do you pay for that? And is the party willing to make the case, for instance, for income tax rises, as it did in the late 1990s and the 2000s, or do we live in a context where the tax burden is too high on too many people after many years of real terms freezes and the tax threshold for that to be viable? If I may, a belated answer to Kevin's question on Trump and tariffs. I mean, I think what's striking is that in both main parties in the United States, there have been protectionist currents for many years, reinforced by the fact that the sort of Rust Belt seats have been swing seats, Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan. And there has been this kind of dream that manufacturing can be kind of reshored and restored to its former glories. And I guess if Trump is going to do that, then that would be proof of concept as to whether it can be done. If it doesn't work, then I guess some people on the centre left who have been quite indulgent towards protectionist arguments for a variety of reasons may retreat from them, and the sort of liberal case for trade may be more compelling than it has been.
Okay, we've got time for just one last question. Good one to ask Chris at the back there, and then I'm going to ask the final thoughts from both of our speakers, and I'll give my own just because I'm an MP and I can.
And the relevant spokesperson. My question is partly about the current state of the economy and partly about how we then move forward with it. So it strikes me that one of the greatest challenges the economy has at the moment is the number of people who are, in inverted commas, economically inactive. We have a very aging population. We have a challenge with young people getting into the workplace because of I would potentially argue, the impact of technology on entry-level grades and the questionable need for some of them now. And so my question really is, when you consider the work of Keynes and you consider the economic environment in the 20s and 30s, are there any lessons that we can learn from that to transpose on our current situation of high levels of economic inactivity?
That is a great question. Thank you, Chris. Do you want to come to you first?
Well, again, Keynes thought that unemployment, he had a very compassionate view towards people that didn't work or couldn't work, could have been put out of work, because he thought that it was a waste. It was a waste of resource, but also he felt very compassionate about poverty and about human suffering, and I think that that's perhaps how we have to view it. From the point of view of being compassionate towards people. I'm very taken that I've been reading recently Edith Stein's PhD thesis on empathy, which she published in 1917. And I think it's about time that we took this idea of empathy a bit more seriously. I also think that there's work in economics that doesn't get much airtime, but it's the economics of happiness. Richard Layard, who is a Quaker and purportedly the world's expert on happiness, and David Blanchflower, they sort of say that we should be encouraging politicians not to look simply at gross domestic product, but but happiness as well. And when you look at the record You know, as well as unemployment and people that can't work and people that are disabled and so on. You know, if we look at the amount of anxiety and the amount of young people who are facing the future with a terrible view of hopelessness, you know, I think that we have to take that into account as well. And you know, I'm not suggesting that we all rush out and buy Edith Stein's PhD thesis on empathy, although it is still in print. But perhaps if we had this, and I do think that Keynes had this empathetic understanding of people, even though he was very ostentatious. He was part of a celebrity couple when he married a Russian ballerina, and all that sort of thing. But I think empathy, compassion, I think Keynes was there.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think that's really interesting. I mean, in some ways, I'm quite uncomfortable about the notion of sort of economic inactivity, because we know that there are lots of ways of being productive and active and contributing to society and having a rich life that aren't focused on paid work. And I think that sometimes tends to get missed because the government wants tax receipts, and therefore it wants to get people into the labour market. And I do think Keynes had an empathy for that. And I mean, in the context of the 30s, obviously, long-term unemployment was extremely damaging, particularly in industrial towns, in a male breadwinner context, and in which many men's sort of sense of worth was tied up with employment. Obviously, the whole social context has changed, and I think we would welcome much of that change, particularly as far as gender norms are concerned. But I think there are, so whether there are lessons to be learned or not, I think there is. Yeah, I think thinking carefully about what forms of economic activity and social activity look like, and what people want to do, and how when and how it's appropriate for the state to support them in doing that is really important. I mean, clearly, the household means test left a real scar on many communities and many families in the 1930s. It was actually a real problem for liberals fighting in labour areas in the early 30s, if they were responsible for administering those kind of things. And it may well be that universal credit and some of the cuts that are coming down the line will have similarly scarring effects on people's lives. So yeah, government has to be very careful.
Thank you very much. I've got just 3 minutes left, so I'm going to share some of my thoughts and hopefully provide some reassurance. One of the questions I keep getting asked at the moment is whether our party is centre left or centre right, and on economic issues. And I keep rejecting the premise of the question because I say we are distinctly liberal and we don't define ourselves in relation to the other big parties. But I want to assure you that in our economy and business team, we are thinking big. We are acutely aware that AI is here and is going to rapidly transform our economy in ways that we can't anticipate. We have the impact of the climate crisis. We have people living a 100-year life is going to become the norm. People living very long times, living for many years, which is in many ways is a huge public policy success, but also really changes the nature of work and where people engage in the workforce, and which maybe on a kind of non-continuous basis. And we're also acutely aware about poverty and intergenerational justice as well. But we also know that our country faces a number of very immediate problems, as Peter sort of touched on, around high borrowing. We don't have an unemployment crisis, but we have a skills crisis in this country. Productivity is a major problem facing our country more acutely than many others. And we do have a number of people who are working in a very precarious situation. For what it's worth, we as a party have been talking about health and wealth being two sides of the same coin. That slightly answers the question from the gentleman at the back. We are the only political party talking about that, talking in those terms at the moment. We keep saying you cannot grow the economy if you have a workforce that is ill and is picking up the pieces of a broken social care system. So health and wealth being two sides of the same coin. And I've now said that so many times that every time I say it, the press team take the piss. So that's the first thing that we keep talking about, health and wealth being two sides of the same coin. And that's why we continue to encourage the governments to invest in health and social care in particular. The second area, I think I would agree actually to answer your question directly, that inequality is slightly the elephant in the room and people don't like talking about it because it's politically inconvenient and it's difficult. But I think we have to tackle it head on. One, because it's the right thing to do. and secondly, because we're seeing the product of it. So we're seeing the rise of populism. I don't believe that populism is a direct result of inequality. The two are very linked, because I think a lot of the rise of populism is linked to much deeper sense of identity, the breakdown of community, and a bit of self-esteem and self-worth as well. So I think it goes beyond inequality, but there is absolutely no doubt that inequality is one of the major ingredients that is fueling the inequality that we're seeing. And the third is that right now in the public discourse, we are completely alone in being a party that's talking about our internationalism. And to tackle the question about Trump's tariffs, I think his tariffs are a terrible idea. And we are the only party talking about growth as part of the answer to this. And the obvious answer to growth is to have a better deal with the EU and to have a better trade deal. And one of the crazy things that the Labour Party has done is they put themselves into a straitjacket, not just in terms of saying we won't raise taxes and we won't cut services. Obviously, they're going to probably end up having to do both, but they're also saying they won't even negotiate a better deal with the EU. So they put themselves into such a tight straitjacket that it's a huge, huge problem. But I do think that right now we are distinctly liberal, we are distinctly internationalist, we are talking about health and wealth as two sides of the same coin. And I think for myself, as a Treasury spokesperson, I've seen what the state can do during the pandemic. The Tories got a lot of things wrong, but goodness me, didn't the state move when there was a crisis? And so I think we have to hold out hope that we can be ambitious, that an active state can make people's lives better, and we just need to be bold and brave in the ideas that we develop in the months and years to come. And on that note, thank you all very much for coming.